My name is Samantha Thompson, Chief Inspector of the Metropolitan Police Service of London. We are conducting this testimony as part of an ongoing confidential investigation, and all information provided below will be owned by the police and may be used as evidence to be attached to the case file of this investigation. Please, sir, can you tell us what you know about Edward Lowell?
My name is Edmund Gobson, and honestly I don't know whether to feel happy or sad to be here with you. I feel happy to be helping in some way, but sad to have to recall these dark memories I lived in my past. Gentlemen, it seems like even God is angry at what's happening. Let me continue. I remember Edward Lowell well. He was a peculiar fellow who owned an antique shop in London. At the time, I was just a young man who had recently started working in the antique store. Edward was always very reserved, but there was something in his gaze that made me uncomfortable. I never knew exactly what it was, but I always had the feeling that something was wrong with him. It was more than 40 years ago in 1920 that Edward received an ancient artifact from Egypt. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know that something changed in Edward after that. He began to act strangely, becoming increasingly isolated and increasingly obsessed with the artifact. That's when the murders began. I still remember the newspapers of the time talking about the brutal and grotesque deaths that were happening in the city. Edward was the main suspect, but no one could prove it. The crime scenes were always the same, a bizarre ritual. People with their mouths sewn shut, their eyes pierced with needles, their hearts ripped out of their chests with bite marks, and some symbols made of the victim's blood that no one could decipher. 2 years later, the police finally caught him, but he wasn't sentenced to death. Instead, he was diagnosed as insane and spent the rest of his life in the Bethlehem Royal Hospital Asylum, where he died in a bizarre way. His face seemed to have been ripped off his head, leaving only a gaping hole covered in worms and beetles. And what puzzled the guards and doctors the most was that no one could enter his room, as only Dr. Edmund Goldwing, the chief director of the asylum, could open his room, and he had gone home after a torrential storm had been announced on the news. And now, ladies and gentlemen, more than 40 years later, we are faced with the same grotesque scenes, identical to Edward Lowell's crime scenes. I know it wasn't him. It's impossible because I went to his funeral myself and saw the terrible scene with that hole that seemed deeper than the bottom of the sea. I don't know what happened, but I have a feeling that something much darker and more sinister is behind these murders. And that's why I'm telling you this story, young investigators. You need to uncover the truth behind these crimes before it's too late.